Hey everybody, welcome back. I know it's been a little while since my last video. I've gotten a little bit behind on recording. I have made some progress though in updating the backlog of written tutorials on the blog nixniche.net. So you'll start to see here pretty soon some more entries being up there to follow along with on top of the videos that are already existing here on YouTube. But for today's video, we're going to be going over how to use rolling averages within Pandas data frames. In my opinion, being able to calculate rolling averages is invaluable for this type of analysis. It really helps you identify recent trends and helps you kind of compare to their overall season, or maybe how they typically play against a certain team. You can look at, we're not going to get this complicated today, but this same logic could be utilized to see like their last 3 away games, last 3 home games, to really get into the nitty-gritty and identify some more micro trends. And especially if you're going to be looking at feeding this type of data into a predictive model, whether it be machine learning, neural networks, what have you, this type of data can really help, because then you'll be looking at not just kind of how they're doing season-wide, but you'll be feeding in specific data for that player's last 3 games, last 5 games. Are they on a hot streak? Are they on a cold streak? Are they due for a good game? If they had too many good games, they're probably going to have a cold night. Those types of things are going to be a lot easier to identify using this type of method. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and hop in and take a look at Pandas here. So, first off, we need to import Pandas. Going to be kind of the same. That's just kind of a necessary step that we have every time. Next up, you're going to import your data into the data frame. Now, I will say, if you don't already have a nice data set of box scores, go get one. If you're not sure how to get one, check out my previous tutorial videos on web scraping, and you'll be able to find that information there. I'll put the data set I'm using as an example, will be linked in the blog post, and that link will be down in the description, so you'll be able to download what I used as well. But again, feel free to use your own data if you have it. So we're going to bring it in, and then just like we usually do, first step is going to be to use the head function, just kind of take a look at the data and see what we have. And as you can see here, I already have a fantasy point calculation. That is something that we had done on a previous video. Is one of the tutorial items, how to calculate based off of existing statistics in the data set. So if you're using a clean data set, you'll need to calculate out your own fantasy points. If you want to use that for the purposes of this video, you don't need to be using fantasy points. You could do points, rebounds, assists. I mean, if you have minutes, you could even do minutes to see if there's anything in the minutes you want to look at. But we're going to be using fantasy points, so if you don't have this data set specifically, your numbers probably aren't going to be the same when you run it at home, but it's pretty easy to verify if it's the correct last 3 game average or not, which we'll get to in a minute. So one thing we need to look at and think about is this game date field, right? So that's obviously a date, but that is not a date. It's not a datetime data type. So if we try to sort our data frame, here, let's look at the top 15 to get a little bit better look. So we have all February 13th, and that is probably the most recent games. The date on the file there is the 15th of February, so that's probably accurate. But if we try to sort by date, let's see, so if we take df2 equals df dot sort values, and we want to sort by game date. Now let's take a look at df2. So if we sort the game date, it's going to start with January 1st, 2020. And whether you're sorting, most recent to oldest, oldest to most recent, either way, it should not be starting on January 1st, 2020, because the season started in October, and we already have dates in February of 2020, so either way, it should be February or October, and that's because it's looking at it as a string. So it's not factoring this in as a date, it's just factoring it as a 0 and then a 2 Just like if you're doing alphabetical order, it'd be all the A names, and then the AA, AB, AC, AAA, AAB, AAC. That sort of sorting is what's going on here. So what we need to do is change the data type of the game date column to an actual datetime type. And to do that, we're going to utilize this command here. And what this is we're saying from our data frame, we're looking at the game date column, and we want that to equal our data frame game date, and then the function we're running is the as type. Datetime 64 is going to be the datetime data type that is called in Pandas. That's what they use. If we just said datetime, it'd be wrong. So you'll need, if you're trying to convert data types, make sure to check the Pandas documentation, because this is a string that we're sending through, and different packages, Pandas, NumPy, scikit-learn, different packages use some different terminology sometimes. You just want to make sure that you're actually calling the right thing. So if we run that and then look at df.head again, we'll notice that the format has changed. If we want to sort again, and we're just going to rerun this and redefine that to take a look at it. So if we sort by game date again, and since we're calling our initial data frame, and that's what we updated down here, we're going to have the updated game date field. And then let's look at the top 15. And yep, sure enough, now we see October 22nd, 2019. Then we can check and make sure it's running backwards correctly. So we start with the oldest games. Let's see if we end with the newest games. That's fine. That works. What I did here is I introduced another parameter to the sort function, just ascending. And you can look up any of these functions that we run if you want to get more familiar with the more specific parameters you can use. Just check out the Pandas documentation for each function, and it'll give you all the parameters and what to pass to it and what it's going to do. So ascending, we changed equal false. The default for that is ascending equals true. As long as you're using the default parameter, you don't need to put it into the function. That's why we didn't need it first, but we did if we switched it to false. Okay. And alternatively, another way we could have looked at that, instead of changing the sort again, we could have just ran the tail function and looked at the last 15 items here and saw that they were all February 13th. Did the same thing for this purpose, but it's good to know that ascending value, that parameter, because we're going to use that here in a minute to get a more complex sort. But now that we have our game date data type as a date time, and we kind of understand how the sorting is going to work, we verified it, we know it's sorting correctly, let's go ahead and move ahead. And just to kind of walk through the logic of what we're going to do here, we want to look at each player, right? Each player individually, because we don't want, the last 3 games period on this data frame. Like, we don't want to look at all 3 of these values and get it, because how Gallo did, how Hayward did, how Ferguson did, those are pretty independent of each other. I mean, I guess Gallo and Terrence Ferguson, not necessarily, because it was the same game, but you understand what I'm getting at here. So we don't necessarily just want to run it. We could write a more complex statement that breaks out individual data frames as the player and creates a dictionary on the concatenated player and game date, and then looks at just those games from that player, like the last 3 before it. You could do it that way, but it'd be much more difficult and a little bit uglier. But there's a little bit easier way to do it. And first up, we're going to need to resort this table. And it's going to be a little bit more complex of a sort statement, so let me walk you through this. We have sort values, but as you can see here, I'm passing 2 different columns through. So that's just going to be a compound sort or a multi-level sort. What that means is, first, we're going to sort by player name, and once you've sorted by player name, we're going to sort by game date. Ascending is going to be true for both, and for that you just pass it as a list, and it's going to assign the first one to the first column, the second one to the second column. Those don't both have to be the same to work in the function, but for what we want it to do, and I guess it doesn't necessarily really matter for the player name. as long as the date for those players are going to be ascending. That's going to be the important part, because we want it to be oldest to newest, because we're going to go 3 games at a time, and that's going to give us our more accurate values. Now this last bit here, ignore index equals true. That's going to be important, because you see, we haven't defined the player name as the index yet, and there's a reason for that. We don't want to do what we're going to do. So Pandas automatically gives us an index, which is going to be this column of bolded numbers here. And you can see if we do tail, they're in order now. If we do tail, they're going to stay in order. That's fine. But the problem is the rolling average looks at the index. Okay, the index is what's going to be important for that. And that can give us some problems if it's not in order once we sort it by player. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's run this, but let's take the ignore index off. Let's take a look at df.head. Okay, so before, after we sorted, we ran the head, we started index 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Because that's the order that the data came in from the Excel spreadsheet. But when we sort it, now, 14,293, 13,861, 13,629, like those are pretty big discrepancies, jumping from line to line in that index. But when we throw the ignore index equals true, that's going to reset the index for our new sort, which is what we want. So if we do 50, we can look down here, and obviously we have Aaron Gordon pretty much all the way down except for the 50th item with Aaron Holiday. But then you can see, again, we're at 49. That's good. That's what we want. We want the index to start at 0 after it's been sorted. So now that we have it sorted how we wanted to, the next thing up is to define our rolling average function. And this is going to be a little bit complex, so we're going to step through this bit by bit. If you recall from the previous Pandas video, when we defined this fantasy point column here, much like we would call, let's see, df game date as an existing column, to create a new column, you can do the same thing, but if you type in a column name that isn't existing, it's going to try and create a new one. So you need to make sure to have a function here that's returning values. So we're defining a new column. I just titled it last 3 for the last 3 games. And then df.groupBy, we're going to group by player, and we don't want to sort because we've already got our sort sorted out. We don't want to sort because we already have our sort figured out. So what that's going to do is it's going to group by player, and it's going to group, and it's going to return the rolling function. And here's where we define our window, our rolling window. I'm going to use 3 games because we're doing last 3. That can be as many games as you want it to be. The min periods equal 1. I like to specify because, for instance, we wouldn't have a value until after the 3rd game otherwise, right? It would give us not a number, and then the average of these 3 games. For min periods 1, it's going to return the average of what you have available if you don't have the full window. So for game 1, the average is going to be the same as game 1. After 2 games, the average is going to be the average of the first 2, and then you get to your rolling 3-game average at the 3rd game. To me, it adds value, mainly because if you're looking to put it into any sort of machine learning algorithm, you can't work with not a numbers. You're having to put something in. You're going to have to drop those games out. You're going to have to replace it with a 0 or with the season average, something else. So I'd rather just have, that value there. I think that's more accurate to be brought into those type of predictive measures. Okay, so we've defined our rolling function, but what are we performing the rolling function on? We know we're looking at the player, but this .fp is referencing the fantasy point column. That's just kind of another way of calling this function, but if we were calling the fantasy point column in here instead of last 3. It's another way to do it in Pandas. I typically don't like to do it, but it makes a function like this a lot cleaner to call it that way. but you do run into issues with that if you have spaces in your column names. So as a good rule of thumb, I don't put spaces in my column names, but especially if you like calling columns like this, you'll definitely want to avoid it. So we're get a 3-game rolling window. We're looking at the fantasy points and we want the mean. Okay, and this is all again part of this group by function. So what this is going to return right here is, I think we did group by functions in the previous Panda videos. I'm not positive, but I think we did. Either way, it's going to be similar to a pivot table if you're familiar with that in Excel. It's going to group out each player, and then we're wanting to look at the fantasy points. So it's basically just going to return a 2-column table, player and last 3, and then we're telling it here, this portion here is telling it what that last 3 column is going to be. So we want the mean of the fantasy points, but our rolling window is 3. So the fantasy point mean for the last 3 games, where we have at least 1 entry there. And then we simply reset the index and drop the player, and that's going to bring that information back into this table without altering anything. So let's run it and take a look. df.head 15. And sure enough, now we have a last 3 column. And just like I was saying, when there's only 1 entry, we have the exact same value. When there's 2, it's an average of these 2. When there's 3, now we start getting into the rolling 3-game average. And that's going to be what we want. Now, let's take a look at the 50 again and head down here to Aaron Holiday. And now, something I've ran into in the past when I was trying to figure out how to get all this to work right is sometimes it would take the values from the previous player and apply it when it got to the new one. So this Aaron Holiday first value would be an average of these 3 right here. And obviously we don't want that. Fortunately, we've got it sorted out, and it works fine without having to use a more complex, ugly method. But just to show you there, to verify that when it starts with a new player, it starts that whole rolling window process over again. So now that we've established that our last 3 is working properly, and let's go ahead and just as a random calculation here, let's look at these last 3. So we'll do 29.6 plus 4.4 plus 26.8. Okay. And we'll put all of that in parentheses and divide by 3, and we should get 20.266667, 20.26. Okay, so yep, so we just rounded off one there to end that that number, but just as a verification to make sure that we're getting the right average there, just to spot check ourselves and make sure that it makes sense. Now what we're going to do is we're going to resort this. But I'm going to show you another, just another way to do a sort like this. So up here we're defining when we sort, we're calling, the same df equals df.sort values, right? So we're reassigning this variable based on itself. And that's good practice to do to make sure that you don't accidentally overwrite something. So if we call df now, this is already going to be done. What I've done up here is create a new variable, df2. Anytime you want to do something, that can be good practice to make sure your core data set stays the same, and you don't have to come up here and re-import it every time. Because if you're working with a big data set, importing it can take some time. But another way to call it in place is going to be to run the same sort values. So we're going to do sort underscore values, and we want to do game date. And this parameter in place equals true. That's going to be a parameter that's in almost every single Pandas function. And what that is saying that we want to do it in place, or overwriting the existing data frame with the result from this function. So typically you don't want to do that because it can be a little dangerous if you type it in wrong, or you you know, you misspelled something, had the wrong parameter, now you have to go all the way back and rerun up to that point your entire code base to get back and take that out and run it correctly. But just so you know, that is an option. We're going to do ascending equals false to get the most recent ones. Okay, so now we're looking here. We've got last 3 for all of these players, which is wonderful. But let's say we're interested in one player specifically. The way we can call that information and basically slice out that data and slap it into a new data frame to look at is going to be, well, first off, we're going to set the index to player in place equals true. And then just so you can see that, it's going to take away these numbers here, and we're going to be left with the player there instead. So now the player is the index. And let's do df, I don't know, Zubats equals df.loc is going to be, think of it like locating, like you're locating a value from the index. And we want Zubats. So now if we just look at our Zubats data frame, now we have all of his games. There's the most recent 15 from February 13th to January 14th. And you can see he's a pretty consistent player. 22, 22, 25, 22, 25. For his rolling 3-game averages, that's not half bad. So that's how we can kind of check and see what we have with rolling averages. You can do that for any player. You can do that for groups of players. In the last video we did, we separated out, you know, all the instances where a player scored 50 fantasy points or more. You could do that same thing and look at those trends. See if it was kind of an anomaly that they scored that much, or like someone like James Harden who probably averages almost 50 fantasy points a game. You know, you can go through and find all of that. You're really only limited by your own creativity and how you can use these tools. But that's going to be all of the information we go through today. We are getting dangerously close to starting to look at some machine learning algorithms and how we can start predicting fantasy output. I do want to get the backlog of written tutorials done before we move on to that, because that is a pretty big task. And once we start going forward with that, I just know I'm not going to have the time to go back and get those tutorials updated. So I'm making pretty good progress. We're getting close. So again, you know, if you like the content, go ahead and like the video, subscribe. It really helps. It's something like 2/3 of the watch time on this channel is from unsubscribed viewers, which, you know, obviously I like having the content that people like to come watch, but it really helps if you're subscribed. One, it's easier for you to stay up to date because you'll get little notifications and everything when I put out a new video. And 2, it lets YouTube know that people are engaged and invested in the content, so it recommends it to more people, etc., etc. So if you like what you're seeing, hit that like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. If there's anything we haven't done yet that you'd like to see, or if you have any specific questions about this stuff, let me know down in the comments. I'm pretty good about answering questions in the comments that are answerable in that format. And if there's something that you have a question about that needs a little more work to get an answer, I'm more than happy to make a couple videos going over some of those and walking through those processes as well. But if you don't let me know down below, I don't know you want to see it. So, until next time, thanks everyone. See you later.